Hello and good morning. Our presentation is titled Language's Effect on Societal Expectations and Perceptions. Language obviously has a strong impact on societal expectations and perceptions. A reason why I personally wanted to explore this topic is because my IB classes of psychology and English has pushed me to dive in deeper into situations such as the ones that we're going to explore throughout this presentation. So to begin, our first example would be Ted Bundy. Bundy was suspected of killing over 30 women. Throughout his trial period, he walked around unshackled, he had very loose supervision, and he even was able to escape twice. An officer claimed that he had a chameleon-like appearance, meaning that his appearance and people's perception of him changed per situation and per individual. So this brings me to our knowledge question, which is, to what extent does language and perception influence bias and unethical standards? We wanted to focus on the effects that language has on perception and how this relates to legal cases and unethical and ethical standards. So with this, we wanted to break down a few key words in this knowledge question. Our first word would be language. Language is the principal method of basic human communication. Our next word is perception. Perception is a judgment resulting from awareness or understanding. And lastly, ethics, which is a system of moral principles. So let's bring it back to Ted Bundy. Bundy knew that people perceived him differently than he perceived himself. He also stated in his tapes that women are possessions, and this goes along with his relationship with Marlon Lee Bortman. Bundy stated, "When I met Marlon, I was attracted to him because his wife could cook good sushi." It was also known that Bundy loved Marlon's Volkswagen Bug, and Bundy ultimately later ended up buying a car very similar to that of Marlon's. This goes to show that Bundy saw Marlon's wife and the car as elements that Marlon possessed in his life rather than the woman being an actual human being. The next quote that I wanted to look at by Bundy says, "It is a little after 9 o'clock in the evening. My name is Ted Bundy. I've never spoken to anybody about this, but I am looking for an opportunity to tell the story as best I can. I mean, I'm not an animal and I'm not crazy. I don't have split personality. I mean, I'm just a normal individual." So with this, he states the time and he states his name, giving the people that he's talking to, or the journalist, a brief explanation of who he is and a little bit of background so that the journalist can kind of empathize with him. He also states that he's never spoken to anybody about this before, which establishes an element of trust between Bundy and the journalist recording these tapes. He also states that he's looking for an opportunity to tell his story, which provides a sense of innocence about the crimes that were committed and gives the journalist and those who were to later listen to the tapes an idea that Bundy was in fact innocent. He also goes on to state that he's not an animal and he's not crazy and he doesn't have split personality. A lot of times the language of saying, "Oh, you're such an animal," is used to kind of give a bad perception of somebody. So Bundy used this word animal, crazy, and the phrase split personality to give a sense of innocence about his case once again. So the journalist who was recording Bundy's story wanted to try to get more information about the crimes that were committed during this time. So with this, he would interview Bundy over a series of weeks, and after a while he realized that he wasn't really getting anywhere with Bundy. Bundy just wanted to continue to have that small talk. So he came up with the idea for Bundy to speculate what happened during these crimes. He also came to the realization that Bundy did not really want to give the story of the crimes, but rather a celebrity bio. So Bundy stated, "People perceive me differently from how I perceive myself, and I need to give others a chance to know what was really going on, what it was really like for me." So with this, his speculations about what happened was to give a sense of innocence throughout his trial period, which ultimately resulted in the unethical standards of him being unshackled. So he did not have the belt chain, he didn't have a leg brace or anything that would prevent him from escaping. And he also was very loosely supervised. He was able to go into the courtroom library while the trial was not in the court session. And this was done without supervision. So he was able to escape throughout the library window once, and he also escaped once more at a later time. So in October of 1967, the main official on his case stated that Bundy was charged with first-degree murder with premeditation. Now, at this time, this type of charge would result in the death penalty. He was charged with this in Utah, and Utah allowed him to be sent back to Colorado to be tried further. At the time, this was very unusual, and typically if you are charged with something in one state, you are not sent back to another state to be further tried. So all of this goes to say that Bundy used language in order to change people's perception of him, which did influence bias and ethical standards throughout his trial period. So this brings me to another case of Jussie Smollett. Smollett was originally charged in March of 2019 with a 16-count indictment. But these charges were suddenly dropped without any explanation and without admitting that there was wrongdoing in this case. Smollett had claimed that two men who were brothers came, beat him up, raised racial and anti-gay slurs at him, and threw bleach at him. They even tied a noose around his neck. Now, this was something that was not true. These two men came to the police and gave a statement that they were paid by Smollett to do these acts because Smollett wanted to increase his popularity in the media as well as increase his income. So with this, Smollett was arrested, and while he was arrested, these charges were not further explored, which was very interesting. And these were dropped and he was released from prison. About 5 months later, new charges showed up on Smollett's account. And this was brought up by an investigation by a prosecutor who overruled the state's decision to dismiss the original case. So with this, Smollett's personal attorneys advised him to stay off of social medias because they claimed that anything that Smollett could push out, whether that be positive or negative claims, can ultimately be used against him in his trial period. So it's about a little over a year later, and Smollett is currently still on trial for lying to the police. Going back to the use of language, he was absent from media. There was no news or anything about him throughout this past year because he was afraid that this language could be used against him in his trial. Official also stated that he could be known as a whitewash of justice due to the fact that as somebody who is part of the Black and gay community, he was using these claims of being attacked to increase the popularity of those two communities as well as his own personal gain of popularity and an increased pay.
So this leads us to our second knowledge question, which is how can language be used to shape perception in ethical ways? So previously with our original knowledge question, we looked at how language and perception was used to create bias and unethical standards. With the case of Ted Bundy and Jussie Smollett, they were able to carefully craft their language in order to create this positive perception about themselves in order to break codes of law to create unethical standards in the community. However, now we will be taking a different approach, seeing how language and perspective can be used to create ethicality. So this leads us to our counter real-life situation, which is the case of Harvey Weinstein. For those of you who don't know, Harvey Weinstein is a famous film producer in Hollywood. He's best known for his work in Pulp Fiction, Good Will Hunting, and Shakespeare in Love. Now, around 2 years ago, actresses Rose McGowan and Ashley Judd, who were actresses that worked with Harvey, were among the first women to come forward stating that they had been sexually assaulted by Harvey Weinstein. And once these women came forward, a lot of other women who had also worked with Weinstein came forward and said that they had also been sexually assaulted by him, which sparked a larger movement globally where women from all over the world were coming forward and saying that they had been sexual assault victims. So Harvey Weinstein was put on trial for this, and in order for his trial to go smoothly and be carried out ethically, the prosecutors wanted to reshape the jurors' perspective of what sexual assault actually was, because during this time there were a lot of fallacies around sexual assault, and many people believed such things as that if a woman went into a hotel room with a man, then she was practically asking for it, which is obviously untrue. So the prosecutors wanted to make sure that the jurors understood this in order to get the full view around the trial, and so that Harvey Weinstein could be successfully condemned. So some of the language used by the media to describe Weinstein was that he was a master manipulator and rampant predator. He had sexually harassed and assaulted women for decades with impunity. Now, these languages describing him as a master manipulator and rampant predator really took an attack on his character and changed the perception of how people saw him in Hollywood. They saw him as this big, powerful man who used his status in order to sexually assault women. And because of this, many people had a negative view of Harvey Weinstein, which heavily influenced his case. However, Harvey Weinstein showed a different perspective of himself. He quoted that he had no great powers in the industry, and that Miramax, which was his company, was a smaller company than any Walt Disney, any Sony, Paramount. That he could not blackball anybody, because he said that if he didn't want to use an actor or actress, the people at Warner Brothers would simply contradict what he said or use the actress anyway. However, he stated that this trial became blown up because the media took to him saying that it was all about power. However, it wasn't about power to him. He stated that he was simply about making great movies. So this shows the two different perspectives of Harvey Weinstein: the media's perspective, who was very negative toward Weinstein, using very harsh language to describe him, and then Weinstein's own perspective, as he believed that the media's perspective was not doing him justice, and that he was not this big, powerful man that people said he was. However, most of the people, since there were so many sexual assault cases against him that came forward, many people in society believed these women to be true, and because of that, he was sentenced to 23 years in prison, while many men before him went away without even being accused or put on trial at all, which shows how, through language and describing Weinstein as the man that he was, they were able to put him on trial and successfully condemn him, while many before him were not. So I just want to go back to our first knowledge question, which was, to what extent does language and perception create bias and unethical standards? And the answer to this question is to a large extent. So language plays a significant role in our everyday lives, as it is around us everywhere, and it is how we communicate with one another. And from people's words and actions, perceptions are formed about the type of person they are and about their character. And these perceptions that we form change the way that we think about the world around us, which aids us to form a certain bias in things that we have a good perception of or bad perception of. So by using language and perception together, the environment around us could be easily manipulated to form a certain narrative about a person or about a certain issue in society. This manipulation can lead to ethical standards to be broken in order to fit a certain narrative or to help those in power to stay in power. So as we saw with the case of Ted Bundy and Jussie Smollett, through their carefully crafted language, their perception of them was that they could not have committed the crimes that they committed because they were simply normal people. So because of this, a lot of the procedures were carried out unethically surrounding their trial or their crimes. As Josie stated before, Ted Bundy had loose supervision, which broke a lot of codes, and Jussie Smollett was never condemned for the crime that he committed. So going back to our second knowledge question, how can language be used to shape perception in ethical ways? We saw that through language we can speak up against the injustices in our world, and that as more and more people start to come forward about a certain issue, that issue gets brought up to the surface so that more people can pay attention to it and be well informed about that subject, which shapes this well-informed perspective for people globally. And with that, more corrupt people are often held accountable for their actions, as we saw with the case of Harvey Weinstein, because the media portrayed him as this person and his trial gained a lot of popularity. All eyes were upon him, which positively benefited his trial because he was actually successfully condemned for the crime he committed, while many before him were not put on trial because women were too scared to come forward or because they felt like they would simply be ignored. So that shows how language and perception can be used to create ethicality. So these are the different perspectives that can be seen with looking back at Ted Bundy, Jussie Smollett, and Harvey Weinstein. The first perspective that can be seen with Ted Bundy is the perspective that a lot of people had, is that Ted Bundy was simply a charming individual, and he was normal like many of those we sit with every day, and because of that, many people thought that he couldn't have done the crime that he actually did. However, a different perspective looking at Ted Bundy is the perspective of the media, and the media used their evidence to form this narrative of Ted Bundy, calling him a monster and calling him out for the things that he did and saying that he was capable of these things, rather than how many people, even those very close to Bundy, saw him. So next we have the first perspective of Jussie Smollett, and the first perspective is that punishing Smollett harshly for the crimes that he committed could have caused a lot of negative media outrage due to the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the movement to end police brutality, was taking place in the United States. So to condemn a black man for this crime could have caused a lot of negative media attention or sparked outrage in our nation. The second perspective that can be seen with looking at Jussie Smollett is that the crime was too small or even maybe justified due to the environment around him during this time, and therefore he was never condemned for this crime. Finally, we have Harvey Weinstein, and the first perspective that we can have upon looking at Harvey Weinstein is that because the Me Too movement was taking place during this time, his trial gained a lot of media attention, and because of that, people wanted to see him punished for the crimes that he committed and did not want to see him walk free like many men before him. And because of this, he received a sentence of 23 years, whereas if his trial did not become as popular, he might have walked away freely. The second perspective that can be seen with the Harvey Weinstein case is that Weinstein was simply successfully condemned for the crime that he committed, and he deserved the sentencing of 23 years in prison. So with that, that concludes the varying perspectives of all three, Ted Bundy, Jussie Smollett, and Harvey Weinstein.